So welcome everyone to this meeting. My name is Vanessa Maydew. I am Communications and Knowledge Exchange Specialist for CABI Livestock, which is the Center for Supporting Evidence-Based Interventions in Livestock. CABI Livestock facilitates the Livestock Data for Decisions Community of Practice, or LD4D. So we welcome you all to this session. Before we get started, if you can check that you have the correct first and last name and organization in your profile. To do this, open the participants list in Zoom, hover over your name and click more to rename yourself. Feel free to turn your video on to say hello and use the chat anytime for discussions and comments. And we'll do our best to address these throughout the meeting. So as you most likely know, today's session is part of our annual community meeting, which has been taking place all week. There are still some sessions coming up this afternoon UK time and also tomorrow, so we do encourage you to check those out, and also we're making recordings available for all the past sessions so you could catch up on anything you missed. You can also connect, share, and learn with your peers using the BrainDate learning platform, which we'll explain a bit more later. So before we begin, if you want to take a moment to say hello in the chat and what brought you here today, that would be great. And I will hand over to Louise Donison, who will introduce herself and the session's objectives and agenda.
Thank you very much, and thanks everybody for coming along to this session. So the title of the session is Livestock Data, FAIR and Ontologies. What are the obstacles and solutions? And this has really come out of speaking to a few other people working with livestock data who are also, like myself, finding it quite hard to implement standards with the data that we've got on our projects. And really it's an exploration of what can we actually do about it. So I'm going to give a bit of a short background to how this session came about. And then I'll hand over to Ruthie, who will share some of her learnings from agricultural data. And then we're going to have a 50-minute sort of interactive session. And so really, this session sort of really evolved from a meeting that we had back in May, where a few different data groups got together, a few of us, and we actually, we really wanted to explore how we could collaborate together on standards. And what we found was, we went through a few questions, and what was interesting is we were all in some way using standards, some similar standards, others different standards. And some people were using sort of more taxonomies, others were using more sort of sophisticated ontologies. Some were actually interested in developing ontologies. So there was a sort of a mix of interests, but we were all very interested in how we could work together. And this idea that we were more, some of our parts, that we were more as a group and as individuals. We definitely had common goals. A lot of us really wanted to make sure that we had data interoperability so we could share data unambiguously with other groups. And we all had a desire to implement standards on our projects or good classification systems on our projects. And what we tried to work out was what would make sense as us as a collective. How could we actually work together? So there was definitely interest in knowledge sharing and learning from others, which is why I'm so excited that Ruthie's come along. And she's going to share some of her experiences working with agricultural data, not livestock, and sort of what are the learnings that we could take from her experiences. But also, I think there was an understanding that actually, were we sure that we were all trying to solve the same problem? And that there was a recognition that for ontologies and standards to be useful, we really actually had to understand what our specific purpose was and our interest in ontologies. And it could be that actually we were trying to solve different problems, but we wanted to have an opportunity to explore what similarities we had amongst our projects and differences. And so to sort of explore that more, after we've heard from Ruthie, we are going to actually have a sort of interactive session where we're going to explore some problem statements. And then finally, I think there's a lot of goodwill around collaborating. And it was suggested that if we could find a use case to work on and even possibly explore funding opportunities, that would be great. But I think we understood that before we could even move to that stage, we really had to see how common our problems were and if they really did warrant a sort of a collective solution. So that sort of frames this session. And now I'm going to hand over to Ruthie to share some of those learnings from some of her other experiences.
Thanks so much, Louise. Can I just, everyone can see my screen okay? Just double checking. Awesome. Thanks, Vanessa. And thank you so much for inviting me and having me. I'm new to the livestock data community. Everyone's been really friendly so far. It is, I must say, it is 6 a.m. for me here on the west coast of California. So I hope that I'm clear in this presentation, but of course, welcome for any questions, either in the session or afterwards. So yes, as Louise said, I'll be talking a bit about, so in my experience, it's mostly soil data, FAIR and ontologies and standards, and just sharing, quite honestly, what are the obstacles that we've faced, and what are the solutions that we've seen so far. So I'm with an organization called CABI, and with CABI, we have been working with primarily donors of agricultural projects that are trying to achieve some sort of impact with good quality data and really using the data that exists or collecting data to be able to make good decisions. And what we're finding and what program officers and grantees are finding is that you can have very good intentions, you can have, you can be heading in the right direction, but good practice and fair data is really challenging. And so we were first asked, why is it so challenging? Why are people struggling to implement good practice and fair when the fair data principles are there, the guidelines exist, there's a lot of thought being put into it. What is actually happening on the ground and within these projects? And then once you know these challenges, how do you think around them? How do you implement good practice? Recognizing that these challenges exist. So either embracing the challenge and figuring out how to deal with it, or figuring out a way to bypass it. So these have been sort of our two core questions that we've really been working with over the past sort of 4 years. We've primarily worked with the Gates Foundation and primarily on soil and agronomy investments based in Ethiopia and India. And data standards are a very common challenge. So if you look at the image to the right, we had several conversations with grantees about what their challenges were. And the question was posed as, if you don't solve this problem, you will not be able to achieve the impact that your investment hopes to achieve. And you'll see along the right, there are several challenges that emerge, but data standards was one of the main ones that came up. And if you look over to the left, this paper was published in 2022. It's excellent. I highly recommend it if you've not come across it. But they say over the past year, several reviews and position papers that have tried to understand what the challenges are, interoperability and standards across agriculture and food sciences often comes up as the top challenge. And so while this is a challenge in the standards community, it is a challenge across the board that everyone is really struggling to deal with. So as part of our previous project I mentioned, we were trying to support investments in soil and agronomy in India and Ethiopia. And one of the work streams that we tried to do was, so because data standards were a challenge, the idea of, okay, well, let's just put together a catalog of the soil data standards that exist. And if we can agree on one that's the best, donors can recommend them, and we can really, start to push for adoption for these various, ones that have been recognized as the best. So let's put together this catalog. And what we wanted to be part of this catalog was, what is the standard? When was it created? What data does it apply to? Who created it? Is it sustainable? When and what situations are you allowed to use it? Who is using it? Which all seem like pretty basic questions. This was not possible to do. You could find the standard. You could find potentially who had created it. Unless you did a huge amount of effort, you would not be able to figure out who used it and their success with it. And what was a little bit nerve-wracking was you couldn't even really understand if it was like a live standard, if it was still being maintained, if it was still being adopted, if it was recognized as something within the community that was actually good. And so instead of we did as best as we could, but instead we did a short piece on why do soil standards struggle to take root, which we were very proud of the title for that, drafted by the wonderful Adafe Onerheim. And so really just try to explore, this is something that the community has recognized as a challenge. And when you are trying to actually go about finding a solution, no one can really take that and do something with it. So what's the case? And so I'm just going to go through a little bit of the results that we found as we've been doing this work. So the paper goes through this really well, but I'll just give a high level description of it. So in general, we found that data standards fail because of 4 reasons. So the approach, the resources, the environment, and the pace. And I'll go into each of these in a bit of detail. So the approach, so data standards can often follow what's called the hype cycle. And so this means that, so there's a technology trigger where everyone gets really excited that data standards as a solution. So of course, recognized as a major challenge, yes, let's solve this problem. And then you hit what's called the peak of inflated expectations, which means that everyone's excited about it to adopt or develop a standard. Funders get really excited. There's a lot of energy behind this standard as being the thing that's going to solve the challenge. And then it's hard, right? It's really, really difficult to actually achieve the goal of what the expectations are meant to be, because as I'll go into later, it's not just standards. And so reality sets in, not necessarily getting results at the level that you would want. And so funding decreases. And the worst case scenario, the standard is abandoned without telling anyone, and just, goes into the beginning of the hype cycle again. But ideally, you hit what's called the plateau of productivity, which means you have the resources to be able to continue your work. You're allowed to learn. You have the networks and the goodwill to actually improve. So the next one is the resources. And it's not just money. You need the people with the right knowledge to be able to understand what the standard is, and even be able to communicate with others who might not have the technical language. Of course, you do have to have the money. You have to have the time to really be able to understand what is needed, and be able to, I guess, take the other resources that you have to really make the right decisions. You have to have the right technological tools. And yeah, I mentioned influence, but I think it's underestimated, and this has gone into a bit of detail in the paper, how much it's a change management process as well, of new standard adoption, which also takes all of these times too, even after you've developed the standard itself. So yeah, people tend to underestimate how much data standards costs in resources beyond money, and can really focus on the very technical documents and not how it must fit into how people actually work. So the third one is the environment. So data standards can lack a clear goal, and that's not necessarily the goal of the standard, but the goal that the standard is required for in order to achieve, something much bigger. So the difference between, the goal being high quality data and the goal being higher crop yield or improved food security. And it's helpful if the goal is shared with everyone involved, and they all really understand why this is necessary to get to where they want to get to. And they can be confused about who they serve. So who is the audience? And who is the audience within the community? And then who is the audience outside the community that is impacted by it? And data standards can be incredibly challenging for anyone who is not making the data standard to understand. And yeah, they don't necessarily see the value of particularly this action in solving what can be perceived as a massive issue that needs maybe something much more robust than a standard. And even with these things, a clear goal, a defined audience, and materials that make the benefits and drawbacks understandable, it might be difficult to take others' needs into account. That is an incredibly time-consuming process where you really have to know your audience. And so if you're just funded to develop the standard and there isn't the effort involved of really understanding others' needs, it's extremely difficult. And this one I found really interesting. So the pace of change. So as I mentioned, standards can be considered something that needs a lot of change management associated with it to make it take hold, to make people understand and really carry them along this change pathway. And so the question is, does the pace of change for standards match the pace of change for business, technology, or funder strategies? So for example, if you believe it's going to take, a couple of years to develop a standard, and it's going to take a couple of years to bring people along in this change management process, is that number of years longer than the typical length of time that a strategic funder keeps their position in terms of their turnover rate? Because that could potentially impact if, you can project that, by your 8th year, the funder will change their direction and might not necessarily want to contribute those resources anymore. Or technology has moved on in such a way that what you planned for wasn't necessarily, still the accepted mode of technology at that time. And so really recognizing that there are paces of change and standards fits into that. And so the paper has some really excellent recommendations for solutions. I won't go into this in a huge amount of detail, even though you probably want me to. And the reason why is because in conversations with Louise and seeing the intro that she gave, a lot of you're doing a lot of this already. You recognize that there's users that you need to have conversations with. You recognize that a community of practice will help. I'm sure you understand that data standards need to be at the heart of the data strategy and things like that. And so I didn't want to go into too much detail here, even though please do in the paper if you're interested. But I thought I'd speak a little bit more about like the much bigger picture that goes beyond, you can as individuals do fantastic work in the data standard and ontology community, but fundamentally it depends on things that are a little bit bigger too. And so how do you deal with that? So as I mentioned, so we've been working with the Gates Foundation now for about 4 years, really trying to understand these challenges around FAIR. And so what our team did, we worked with, so CABI developed, CABI was working on this along with the Open Data Institute. And as we were learning more about the challenges, we saw that, while data standards were one of them, the one that I highlighted, there's a lot that aren't necessarily technical at all. They're much more around like people and processes. And thinking about this, we have this, it's sort of like, what do you need to do in order to be prepared for FAIR? So when you actually get into the very technical conversations, everything sort of aligns around you in the way that you need it, so you can just focus on the very technical work, which in and of itself is very challenging. And so in this sort of like prepared for FAIR direction, the things that we were finding were like, there were very, very large projects that only really focused on, it was just sort of a glance over that there was a massive amount of data involved. It was, sort of misunderstanding of how the way that you needed the data to actually be collected for you in order to make the decision. And the people who were making the decisions just, when they were doing proposal development, didn't know this was even conversations that they had to have. So these are divided in modules. If you go to datasharingtoolkit.org, you can learn a lot more about this. I'll just go through each of them because they're all quite interesting. So the second one was around assessing in-country potential for data sharing. Every country, for the most part, has sort of norms about what data sharing is, but several of those are actually codified legally. And so if you are designing an investment, if you want to be able to take the data, move it out of the country for analysis, and then move it back in, there are countries where that is illegal. You cannot do that. And the awareness of the country that you're working in and the policy environment there, can you actually do what you want to do technically in that environment? The next one was around understanding the effort it takes if you are reusing data from third-party sources, if you're consolidating a lot of data into one place. The data sharing agreements negotiations can take a very long time and often have nothing to do with technical perspectives, but they have to do with trust and personal relationships. And so how do you navigate that? Another one was around individuals' rights when sharing data, so ethics and anonymization, and making sure that you weren't causing harm by any of the practices that you were potentially doing. And then, so around data licensing, making sure you can actually reuse the data, minimizing harmful impacts. So there's the risk of sharing data, of course, but then there's the risk of not sharing data if you have something that is very important to share. And if you don't share it, then potentially poor decisions are made or not the right decision is made. And then ensuring sustainable access to data, which is something that needs to be thought of early on to make sure you have the sustainable plan if this is data that's expected to be used beyond the lifetime of the investment. And so all of these resources were not really to do with FAIR per se. We wanted to call this the FAIR Data Toolkit and then realized we rarely mentioned FAIR. But then if you look over to the right side, these are all the things that are involved with the actual, making of the findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable data. And this is also from that new 2022 paper that the quote was from early on. And just moving to my last slide, even when all of those that I just mentioned say, all your data sharing agreements are in place, you're aligning with in-country policies, you're not going to cause harm, creating clear shared goals, even along the pathway from data producer to user, is complex and incredibly difficult. And I really liked this image because what this shows, I think, is that there are, across this, there are probably several different modes of funding. There's probably a lot of different institutions. There's obviously a lot of different people. There's a lot of different IP. And there are a lot of different decisions around FAIR. And there's a movement around, as a data provider, as a researcher, talk to your user. But there is so much happening between the data provider and the user. And if you look, and you can see ontology management, and it's sort of pushed in there as sort of a, and then we introduce an ontology. But the ontology managers, the people who are in charge of actually making decisions around it, like this community here, is subject to so many other decisions that are being made without necessarily being involved in those discussions. And then even, as I mentioned, the difference between the data provider and even just between here, the data provider and user is subject to all of the decisions that are made in the prepared for FAIR direction. And so, this is the sort of a segue into the next, into the workshop around setting clear goals by aligning on shared problems. Because in reflecting back on that diagram, if the data provider really understands the problem they're trying to solve, the user understands the problem they're trying to solve, and the ontology manager understands what they're trying to solve. There's a clear shared high-level goal that can be communicated with the people in charge of, making sure people's rights are protected and policies are aligned. This might potentially be a step forward to make sure that everyone is at least on the same wavelength, so we avoid that sort of hype cycle and the clear goal of the standard and how it's going to be applied to solve the problem can really be as successful and as likely as possible. So that's me. Thank you so much for having me, and I hope at 6:30 in the morning that was clear and understandable.
Thank you so much, Ruthie. I think for me personally, that was great to hear, because I think one of the challenges I found with working with standards is people think, isn't it fixed yet? What's the problem? And I think we expect that there's a quick fix. And I think what I find fascinating is that it's a lot about the people and communication. So no, that was great. And I can see some round of applause in the crowd, so that's good. So as Ruthie said, we are actually going to try and explore a bit some of these sort of problem statements as a group. What we really want to understand is, do we actually have a clear goal really? And who, what's the problem we're trying to solve and for who? And we thought that we would actually do that as sort of as an interactive session. So we're all going to actually have some work to do. And I think Vanessa's getting up the Jamboard. And so we've got two boards that we actually want to use. So the first board is, we're actually going to explore this statement: we believe that people like persona often have trouble with problem during context. So that's going to be the first board, and we're going to spend probably about 15-20 minutes sort of working through that problem statement for us as individuals, to then start looking to see whether we are actually aligned in those problem statements and who we think we're solving these problems for. And then we'll move on to a second board where we're actually going to look at thinking about what's the benefit and what's the value that we're going to create and for who. So it's really it's really trying to learn from sort of CABI's experiences around the 4 reasons why standards fail to take root, and really look at the environment we're working in. So Vanessa, I see you've got the board up.
I've got the board up. I'm about to paste the link in the chat. So take a moment to open that up in a new window for yourselves. And while you do that, Louise, I think we'll get people into 2 groups. So just bear with me a minute. There's going to be one group that includes Louise and Chipo. I don't know if you've met her, she can wave. She's also from CABI, who works with Ruthie. And then myself and Ruthie will be in the other room, and the rest of you will be distributed at random. So bear with me a moment.
Oh, Vanessa, is it worth us going through how we use the board first? Because I think you'll give clearer instructions than me.
Oh, yeah, okay. So once you're on the Jamboard, in terms of how to use it, you can see my screen now. You have a few tools at your disposal. The main one we'll be using is the sticky note tool, which is here. So when we get to for example, the next screen, so this will be the first board for group 1. And so this is a sample of what we're hoping for. So essentially, Louise believes that people like data scientists have trouble with, what's the problem? Harmonizing animal health and production data. In what context? Collation of grantee data. So that's a very specific problem that Louise feels very strongly about. If you want to add your own sticky note, just click on that icon. I think we'll keep them green. You can type in here. And what it does is it automatically assumes you have more to add, which you can, but you can also click cancel, and then you can move your note around. So the key thing is, you can also delete it. Put your name on your sticky notes and try to follow the kind of format here. So think a little bit about who's having the problem, what is the problem, and when does that problem arise. Does that make sense? Any questions? This is no pressure. We don't need to rush into it. We want to make sure everyone's comfortable with the task before we break out. So I'll start arranging the breakout groups. If there are questions, Louise can answer.
Yep. I'm just checking the chat. So as Vanessa said, we really want this to be sort of interactive. So it's really an opportunity to us sort of explore together this sort of problem statement. And if you've got questions, just put them in the chat. There's no problem. Okay. It's clear. I think the example is useful. Thank you, Isabel.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back.
Hi, Vanessa.
Hi. Great. Louise, do we want to do a little bit of sharing back from the groups or?
Yeah, I think that would be really helpful just to see if we were similar, the two groups, and some of the shared things that we might have observed.
Okay, I'll open up the Jamboard on the shared screen. And so this is the Jamboard for group 1. Hopefully everyone managed to post in the right place, but there might have been a little bit of cross-posting, which is also fine. We had a lot of diversity in terms of the different personae who are having problems. Everything from, data scientists dealing with having to clean and process the data, to data users like modelers who are needing kind of clean data to be able to input into their models. Also data producers needing to generate machine actionable metadata. We also had someone put in this perspective of a livestock farmer needing market price information and needing simple standards around grading. So a huge spectrum really of persona. Anyone from my group wanted, there was a good discussion just at the end. I don't know if Annie or Stacy or Deb wanted to add anything from that.
I guess I can just say that we agreed that it's very hard to look at different data sources when what they're talking about, how they've described things is so different, so that it becomes hard to actually use more than one data source because there's all these differences.
Absolutely, great. Okay, I'll move on to the next frame, which is the group 2 slide. Good, more colorful. So someone from group 2 would like to share a bit?
I can start off, but then I'd welcome other people's sort of views. So I think it was very similar to yours, Vanessa, that we recognise that there's a range of sort of personas, and one of the challenges is really how do you manage all these different sort of people working in the area, that you've got sort of the needs of sort of data scientists, but then you've actually got people working with policy, people doing evaluation. So there's a sort of a whole range of people that sort of have problems with this area, and there's sort of a myriad of problems really that we're sort of all finding that if you want to do modelling, finding the right data, if you want to make policy, it can be quite challenging. We actually sort of got cut off. We were just about to hear from Faith, and I think we'll pick that discussion back up in the breakout room about for government planning as well. So I think it's probably quite similar to yours, but I'm just wondering if anyone else would like to comment from the group.
Yeah, so this is Faith again. So just to share what I was about to put across, so it applies for both NGO that I work for and also the government. So for example, I will talk about the Horn of Africa and the recent drought that has been there. And then in some instances, NGOs want to provide emergency livestock support services, or the government. So usually it's done based on, random calculations, like providing emergency livestock feeds. So there's no data to be able to inform the response, like how much feed, the quantities, or even the issues around water and all that needs to be done. So usually is estimations and not based on the exact situation on ground because of lack of enough data. even when it comes to vaccinations and all those kind of interventions. So I think it's important that there is some sort of system where all this data is put and be able to be used to inform this kind of interventions by the government and NGOs. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Faith. Yeah, so I think it's probably a bit similar to what sort of Deb alluded to as well, that there is data, but sort of how it can be brought together to help start informing some of the policy decisions. I don't know if anyone spotted anything on the board of interest that they want to ask a question about, but I think it was very useful. Yeah.
Okay, great. Do we want to move on to the second part of the question then, Louise?
I think that'd be great, yeah.
So group 1 and 2 have the same starting slide, which is, okay, we've talked about who is having trouble with what, and now to brainstorm or to try to put forward some ideas on what actions, what values or outcomes could be created. And perhaps, Louise, you can elaborate a little bit on what we're hoping to hear.
Yeah, definitely. So this actually sort of almost came up in the first discussion. I think Beth flagged that we're sort of trying to solve this problem, and it's a problem for a certain person, but actually really thinking about who actually ultimately what benefit are we actually trying to create and for who? And so although this is sort of from a data perspective, the standards, really, what is the purpose of what we're trying to do? So in the particular example that I gave, we're sort of some of the work that we're doing with the foundation collating data, really it's to provide the foundation with some sort of metrics for them to actually understand their impact. And so for us, really, that's very much work for our funder. And the sort of benefit that we want to really get out of it is to sort of some sort of measure of impact. But that's just our particular case. There could be lots of sort of beneficiaries, but it's just really unpacking who are we actually trying to solve this problem for, and what sort of benefit are we trying to create for them, what sort of outcome, and yeah, so sort of KPI really of success.
Great. Any questions in terms of what kind of ideas we're hoping to capture? Okay, so group 1, so we're on slide 3. So we decided to just overlay stickies on a copy of the first slide so that we could have our solution sort of stuck right on top of the problems. And so quite a few different types of solutions were proposed. Do any of those solution proposers want to mention what they thought was important or what came up for them? Maybe I'll pick on Georgina.
Yep, you can do that. I don't think I'm really solving the ontology problem, but in order to validate new software or to understand a new data set that we've got, it helps to be able to compare it to what's out there. And to do that, you need to find a data set that is similar. And that's where the metadata that Debs was talking about comes in, would be really helpful. So often the units are different, or just there's messy bits, or the areas are different. So yeah, the bit I'm talking about is I haven't got to it. Proposed literature review looking at the effectiveness of poultry vaccines. Even to do that, which vaccines and which countries, seems a bit of a minefield. And a lot of that data is not even going to exist because it's proprietary, or it's at the farmer level.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Georgina. Deb, you had a couple of interesting ideas which also led to those pink sticky notes being added. Do you want to speak to that?
I guess I'm not a big fan of standards because we have so many of them. And every time people get together, it's like, oh, there's so many standards. Let's create a new one. And I don't think it works because if it did, we wouldn't have so many standards and we wouldn't be talking about creating yet another standard. I think the work is more on trying to map the standards that people use to other standards so that we can make them interoperable and understand what the semantics of the standard is. So, you know, that's more what I think is something that can actually be practical, is look at, you know, like it's almost like it's a meta standard. It's basically saying how do the standards relate to each other. So, you know, look at what people are actually using, and yeah, you can suggest a standard, but you know, people don't go to it unless there is nothing else. And maybe over time, look at which standards are being, you know, like if people see them all, maybe people will change. But, you know, you also have to go back in time to, you know, if you're going to use longitudinal data, if you're doing modeling studies that need that, you can't go back and, you know, usually spend the time to put them into the new standard. But if you can map, then you can still use that data.
But I think there's a risk that assumes we have a perfect set of standards out there, and I'm certain in most of the areas I look, that's not even close to true.
But they don't have to be perfect. Why would they have to be perfect? I mean, nothing's
they
perfect.
don't even exist sometimes. But even if you look at the standards out there, there's not a single standard that stays static. The organic standards change every single year. So,
right. Yeah.
So they're always evolving. So there is always change.
Right. And that's why mapping works, because you don't have to say, I need to have that standard always. I need to keep following it. You know, and what happens with data that's, you know, the producers abandon it because, you know, they lose funding or whatever. We shouldn't give up on that data just because it's not a new standard. We can version.
No, but we shouldn't say we can't create a new standard for anything in the carbon markets or anything like that, because absolutely there is no good standard out there right now.
I didn't say you shouldn't create it, but I don't think that's the first thing that you should be looking at. I think, you know,
depends who you are.
You know, I think people create too many standards. There's just too many of them out there.
Okay, I think that there's good points. You know, there's going to be always a need to look at what's available, and rather than try to come up with the perfect ultimate standard, sometimes there's a case for trying to make do with what's there and finding ways to sort of map across existing standards. But then Simon's point is also that there may be very specific topics where there simply is zero, there's nothing there. And in that case, there might be an argument for doing that. I don't want group one to dominate, so perhaps we'll move on to the slide 5, which is group 2.
I was just going to comment on that discussion around reuse of standards, or whether there's a need for creation of standards. Could be another sort of workshop or something, because it'd be quite interesting to see, because myself as somebody wanting to use standards but not necessarily create them, it's quite interesting. But yeah, like you said, Vanessa, we better move on. I'm happy to kick this off, but I think we had a really interesting discussion, so I'd really sort of encourage other people on this call to contribute. I was sort of looking at the board and thinking it looked quite diverse, and one of the things that sort of Ruthie mentioned was that you do actually get sort of stacking up of people and outcomes. So it's sort of very much, it could be very much like at the modeler data level, creating data that's sort of creating evidence that then sort of goes out to governments and policymakers, that then sort of reaches farmers who benefit from it. So there is very much that sort of layering, and each of us at the different levels might have a different sort of interaction with the standard. But what was sort of interesting is, as a policymaker, I think Isabel said this, and she can jump in, it was more that the way you communicate with people is important, and being clear on the language that you're using and being sure of the sort of definitions. And Casey from GBAD also sort of made a really interesting point that some of the governments are actually sort of almost sort of mandate what standards should be used. So I think what came out from this discussion is it's fine that there are lots of different actors and different sort of benefits, but they do all sort of stack up often. So I don't know anyone else who wants to sort of jump in. I see there's lots of standards flashing up by the looks of things. I can't quite see the chat, but I don't know if anyone wants to say anything.
Maybe if I can jump in here, Louise, Isabel.
That'd be
speaking
brilliant.
from Hungary. Yeah, I think what came out from group 2 was about this estimation of impact. Really, you know, how do we actually, how can you actually get a kind of a standard, you know, impact indicator? So returns on investment, for example, of course, has been used quite a bit, but what does it mean in practice for the livestock, for livestock interventions? So I saw that, okay, I put it once me, but also people as well. Okay, okay.
And Gareth.
And I think as well the issue of gender came up in this group as well, ensuring that it's not only at households level, being able to look into more segregated at gender or at different categories. I think that's what I'm seeing on that screen. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to add anything? And then we have a sort of last closing slide, right, Louise, in terms of what, you know, what should we do next as a group, as a community that is all kind of concerned with these same sorts of issues. So final comments to this from group 2. Okay. Louise, do you want to say a little bit about what we might do with everyone's inputs, or should we come back to that later?
Well, we're definitely going to take this away and try and sort of group some of the responses and perhaps have a look at that sort of stacking up, that actually just see, you know, sort of starting from very much the people working with the data all the way through to sort of policy. But I think it will collate the information, sort of share it with the group, and yeah, so I think we'll definitely try and do some analysis.
Okay, great. So we had created this sort of blank board for next step. So if you're still in the Jamboard, it is slide 6. I'll just paste the link in the chat one more time in case anyone's already closed their browser. So here's the link. And so this is really like, you know, we're here, we're kind of a sub community, right? So it's livestock data for decisions, but this is the group of people who are, you know, dealing with really similar questions and challenges. So how can we sort of leverage the fact that we're all here thinking about this? What can we do next? You know, there's been sort of this ongoing, fairly slow-paced discussion about ontologies, and Louise referred back to that. How can we support each other? How can we share ideas? Any ideas at all about what next steps might be, what would be useful to you specifically? Just feel free to dump stickies with your ideas. So we'll give you a few minutes to do that.
Yeah, and I think just to add to what Vanessa said, that it's this is why this session came around, that I personally find it quite a sort of, it's a difficult area. And I think as those boards have sort of shown that it is quite diverse, sort of people's interest in it. But as a community, sort of when Ruthie went through some of the things that you can do to work on standards, it was that sort of thing around communities of practice. So obviously we're very lucky we've got Vanessa, so we have this sort of ability to run some webinars or try and invite people to speak, or workshops, really online workshops like this. So it'd be great to hear from what you think we could do. Oh, a list of standards. So I mean, that again could be a collective. We can definitely put out an email that I know there's I know people like GBAD have done some work in that area, and I'm sure others like Crawford. So I think that could be something, and I know we did have some sort of documents, so maybe we could create a sort of shared area where we could do that.
Yeah. I think the intention is, you know, right now we're kind of a bit of a discussion and knowledge sharing group, but can this sort of turn us into more of a working group where we actually, you know, work on something that we all benefit from? Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the path in terms of how we hope the different working groups in LD4D will emerge. So that could be, you know, some of these things are quite concrete, so actually could be a very interesting way forward.
I do see one comment, decide Miel, use cases with concrete large-scale implementation of ontologies. I don't know if somebody would like to speak to that. I'd be quite curious too. Perhaps offline.
Yeah, Miel, that was your comment.
Oh, right, it's good to get his mic working.
Okay.
First. Yeah, there's a bit about machine learning. So we've had sort of discussions around that. Pitfalls. All right, so it does look like some LD40 has a list of ontologies by sector. Yeah, so workshop to understand topic areas for ontologies, common language needs. Onboarding a new companies that need to develop data for funders. How data is used and how it could be used. So yeah, there's a few things there.
Am I unmuted at this stage?
You
Yes.
are.
Finally, sorry for the disruption. So what I do like, and I feel this often, is that what we see is that there's a lot of people talking about the value that it would all bring if we would be working like this, but I'm lacking really the implementation side, where we have people showing, okay, look, this is how we worked with the ontology, but also how do you implement it in the cloud? There are some nice solutions where you have a very small data set where you bring in, let's say, the ontology mapping, and then you publish it somewhere. But what if you want to really scale it up? We have data sets from really large, let's say, herds with a lot of valuable information, but how do you do that? I know that the technology has changed tremendously, and we see people talking about how we should do this, but how you really do it, that's what I feel is missing at this stage. And especially if you talk, I saw somebody saying the role of interoperable data standards in precision livestock farming. Precision livestock farming, if you start getting all these PLF technology into tuples or triples, yeah, that's a mess. Your graph databases will be messed up tremendously. And that's what I really miss, the concrete implementations, because that's a bit of that would be my idea. So on the large scale.
That's really helpful, because I know Megan from GBAD couldn't actually join this call, but that was something she had mentioned about sort of really seeing this actually in implementation, sort of seeing how it really works in the real world, and similar to sort of what Ruthie shared with us today, some of the sort of the challenges of implementing standards, but just seeing actually how someone overcame them, and a real world example was something we could think about sort of organising maybe for next year or later in this year, some sort of webinar to see if we could get one or two. I mean, we don't have to stick with agriculture, so that's why I was thinking like human health or something. I don't know. I mean, we could try and see about something which could be a bit inspirational. So I think,
and especially when it gets big, like the small data sets, that's really nice, but the big ones are really the challenge when you almost have to host them really in specific data sets, but then the speed of querying that ontology becomes a mess, and that's what we need. It needs to be workable, because I always see ourselves right now. I think this group of people, we are somewhere in front of where everybody else is. And the rest of the researchers have no idea, let alone that we will push them to, or motivate them to start publishing their data sets into ontologies. And some of these people are now working with precision livestock farming. And if I will bring in a new technology that is slowing them down, we will lose it. So we will have the peloton in the back, and we will be somewhere in front. And that's what
that's great. So I think we've got some good suggestions there. I was All right, gene ontology. So Crawford, I'll speak to you about this. We can share, if anyone's got any suggestions, you can send I think myself an email about any sort of people that anything inspirational that you've heard of, and we could see if we could get some sort of perhaps some sort of webinar to share some case studies. But I think, Vanessa, I'm aware of time. I haven't really got anything else to say other than
we have about a minute. Yeah, I mean, I think it might be useful to, we'll sort through these. I mean, it might be useful to get people's feedback on sort of where the priorities are. And so we might come back to you with a quick survey, or you can just let us know in the chat in our final moment. If you had to pick something to prioritize between now and next, spring, for this group to try to act on, which one would it be? So final minute, and then we'll have to close the call.
And I'd just like to say a huge thank you to Ruthie for accommodating us and getting up at 6 in the morning to share her experiences. I'm very grateful, and I think there was a lot of interest, and I definitely found it really heartening to see that it's not something that's going to be fixed in a few months. It's a long journey.
An absolute pleasure, Louise. Thank you so much for inviting me. And the note that I put down is the ag data community has done some stuff around mapping of standards, have done some of the things that have been mentioned here, and the community is desperate to share their lessons learned. So any way that I can put any other people who are much more technically minded than me and have really spent a lot of time thinking about this, more than happy to introduce them. And I'm sure they'd be happy for their mistakes to help others. And I think they even tried to learn from the human health and medical community too. So can sort of combine efforts to make sure that it does make steps forward a little bit easier for livestock.
That's brilliant.
Great. Okay. So I think with that, we will call this meeting to an end. So thank you all for your time, your ideas. This is a really tricky thing, but we kind of might feel a little bit alone in our organizations, but I think we see that there is a bit of a community here working on similar things. So thank you all so much, and look out for next steps from us.
Thank you very much for your time. See you.